Okay, so hello to everyone for this first appointment of the cycle of a webinar that we are promoting with Into the Black Box. The cycle is called the Radical Thinking in Time of Pandemic. So the idea basically is to start to collectively elaborate some coordinates, some insights about some crucial axes that we have identified for this first cycle of webinars in the question of labor, the question of politics, the question of social reproduction, and the question of ecology. So on one hand, our aim is to start framing how during as a result and during this pandemic, some of these of the characteristics of these crucial axes are somehow changing. On the other hand, our aim is also to start to figure out what can we discuss, what can we see beyond this pandemic. So we would like to keep all these two aspects in mind with this seminar. So again, on one hand, to map what is going on, to cartography the transformation that we are assisting here and now, and on the other hand, to start to envision what can happen after the pandemic or beyond the pandemic. So today we have with us two people, and thanks a lot for being here with us. So we have Francesca Coin and Niels Van Doorn. So we asked them to somehow introduce this topic of labor in the filter, in the lens of social reproduction. So just to add some words, we are trying to develop a perspective on what's going on in the labor context from many different perspectives. On one hand, we are trying to focus if you want, to focus on the frontier of contemporary labor, and I'm talking especially on digitalization processes, digital platforms, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, we also would like to put an emphasis on all the kind of labor that we are seeing that are somehow essential today, essential in a twofold meaning. On one hand, essential in terms of social reproduction, so many kinds of labor that are usually hidden from the perspective of labor analysis, and on the other hand, essential in terms of, if you want, capital reproduction. So just to give you an example, and I'm going to conclude about the Italian situation, a sector that has been considered by the government as essential since the beginning of the pandemic has been logistics. For us, as Into the Black Box, logistics is a perspective of analysis that we are adopting since many years. And so this pandemic has somehow confirmed this crucial role of a sector like logistics. But but many other labor sectors have emerged as somehow essentials in this period. So these are just some snapshots about what we are going to discuss today. Francesca and Niels are going to talk for 15 minutes each. Then we will open for a questions and answers session. So I don't know who wanna start. Maybe I don't know if Niels or Francesca. It's up to you for starting this first seminar of the radical thinking in time of pandemic webinar series. So please.
I think it might work better if I go second. That's how I had anticipated it. But if you want me to start, I can also start.
I can start if you want. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, super. So I've been trying to actually figure out where to start, because it seems as though we're living in a time where every day feels like a week or more, and things are happening really quickly. So it's been not easy to sort of reflect upon the contradictions of this moment. And my talk wanted to problematize the notion of social reproduction at a time in which essential workers are basically being at once glorified and sacrificed. But at the same time, I wanted to keep an eye on the context. And so I wanted to try and frame what's been happening since the first few weeks of this pandemic, and to see how essential workers fit in a picture that is really broad and again is shifting really quickly and is becoming ever more problematic by the hour. So I'll be following my notes for about 15 minutes, and I think my point, I wanted to start from the very notion of lockdown, and so the very decision to sort of freeze the economy really in different countries, first in China, with the assumption that a severe quarantine regime would allow economic sector to go back to normality as soon as possible. And we know that that decision's been also followed throughout the West, and also like in the emerging countries, emerging markets, so to speak. But I wanted to stop for a second to think about what that means, because Adam Tooze, for example, has been saying that the idea of the analogy of war that's been used broadly over the past few weeks is probably misleading, because the idea is not to mobilize resources and to put people back to work, but rather to demobilize the economic sphere and to keep the economy on life support, like a patient in intensive care. And this is fairly important to me, because it feels as though in a neoliberal society, for the first time, in front of the terrifying predictions of sickness and death, there was really no alternative to shutting down the economy. So this was a pretty big step for a few weeks, but we're beginning to see the economic consequences of all of this, and it seems as though the economic problem is going to come back almost with revenge. And so the question is, the question of social reproduction shows all of its ambivalence. In a sense, Silvia Federici spoke of social reproduction in antagonism to the idea of commodity production. And the former never secured the first, never secured social reproduction. In fact, it seems as though sort of the sacrifice and the exploitation that are always necessary in the economic sphere in this phase put labor at risk, not only of low wages, not only of exploitation, but also of infection. There's another thing that I wanted to say, which is that in the current moment, it seems as though also value chains and the logic of just in time are being problematized. Over the past 30 years, we lived in a sort of context whereby the idea of just in time was really dominant, and that implied zero storage space, zero unnecessary stock, zero redundancies. And this could continue so long as there was a flow of cash and mobility of people and resources. But we've seen that the moment we stop and we freeze those flows, the whole idea of just in time becomes very problematic. And there was an article a few days ago in the Financial Times that said from just in time to just in case, thinking that the idea of redundancies and reduce redundancies to zeros had been shown all of its sort of contradictions. I wanted to sort of look at what's been happening in essential sectors. We've all been following the news, and I'm gonna just touch on those. But what became clear over the past few weeks is that there was a class division as to what a lockdown meant, meaning that better paid staff could often work from home in a relatively safe condition, whereas poor and insecure employment and people on poor pay and insecure employment couldn't. And in this case, labor insecurity and the danger of infection went hand in hand. And the wealth divide became also a health divide. And so we're looking at an intersection of low wages, race, gender, and disease oftentimes. I also want to mention a quote by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who said that racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And in this case, vulnerability to premature death is really part of what we see defined as the essential sector. So I'm taking two examples, just the health sector and the agricultural sector. In the health sector, I'm speaking primarily about the case of the UK, and there's been a narrative of save the nation and feed the nation that's been largely externalized to migrant workers. Save the nation, obviously in the NHS, but a sense of nationalized solidarity that externalized on migrant workers the burden and the sort of need to save the nation, but also the sacrifice that was implied with it. And if we look at data around Europe, for instance, we see that the share of nurses and doctors working as medical staff is made of migrants for 35% in Switzerland, 30% in the UK, 25% in the US. And in all these cases, wages are much lower. And again, we have a sense of labor insecurity that is deeply racialized. It is in this context that we've begun to hear words and narratives of sacrifice being used very with a lot of emphasis, and also narratives of love. Boris Johnson said a couple of weeks ago that the NHS is powered by love. It's hard here not to think about the feminist interpretation of love, as you know, when the Marxist feminists used to say in the 70s that it's not love, it's unpaid labor. This seems to fit the idea of workers in the NHS and the idea that NHS staff are heroes. And like a TV show last night here in the UK showed the lack of protection and the also rate of death among NHS staff. And the comment of a nurse in intensive care was calling us heroes just makes it okay when we die. So again, we're looking at the intersection between low wages, race, and disease, and vulnerability to death. In a sense, in a context of necropolitics to some extent, where certain segments of the population seems to be in charge of being the ones who should sacrifice to save the nation. In agriculture, there's been a similar sort of trend, because the idea to feed the nation is the narrative that allowed migrant workers to sort of being recruited really to work in the agricultural sector. And I've been following primarily workers from Romania who've been hired, who've been recruited in Germany, in Italy, and in the UK to work in agriculture. And here what's been happening is quite interesting, because for those who've been following the impact of coronavirus in Romania, the government shut down, so imposed the lockdown before the first death in late February. By late March, unemployment had been skyrocketing to 1 million workers who had been applied for unemployment insurance. By April 2nd, Germany lifted its ban on seasonal farm workers and announced that it would bring in 80,000 people from Romania to work in the agricultural sphere. By April 9, 6 flights departed from Romania for Germany. There were 2,000 people crowded at the airport in Romania on April 9. And the conditions of work are appalling. At the same time, there were charter flights being arranged from Bucharest to the UK. And in a similar fashion, 90,000 workers are now working in the UK farming industry. At the same time, about 107,000 people from Romania are being recruited to work in Italian agriculture. Health protections here are really appalling, because agricultural workers, they're working living in overcrowded homes. They can't choose their employer. They have no health insurance. Transportation costs are being deducted from pay, which means that they are tied to their employer. There have been interviews and sort of workers who said, I feel I have been sold. My government organized transport here, but now I'm at the mercy of the employer. The days of quarantine after the flight have been limited to 1. Pressures to work is about 14 hours a day, 100 hours a week. And it feels like as if the appalling conditions of labor in agriculture are being made even more dangerous due obviously to the problem of infection. If you look at the German narrative, the other thing that I think is quite interesting but also frightening is that the main narrative is that what's important is that these workers be kept away from the population. So the main health precaution that's been taken, given that there has been no testing among these workers and no social distancing, is being that we keep the migrant population away from the rest of the population. So we're looking at a hierarchy of sacrifice, as a racial hierarchy of sacrifice, but also of necropolitics, and to some extent we're looking at political economy of eugenics to some extent. I wanted to try and put this in a larger frame just for the last couple of minutes, because if this has been happening throughout March and early April, towards the end of April, it seems to me that the context is becoming ever more problematic. I'm kind of thinking out loud here, because obviously it's been happening too fast to have like a grip on the events. But there's another element, which is that if we've looked at the condition of essential workers and the glorified sacrifice that's been asked of them, at the same time, we can see that throughout the West, especially in the United States, but also in the emerging markets, unemployment is skyrocketing even there. So we're looking at a staggering 26 million unemployed in the United States, and that becomes much worse in countries that have an informal labor sector, such as India, for example. But I was looking also, just to keep a little bit of a global perspective, at emerging markets. I want to quote Adam Tooze here, who said that there's a complete different dynamic that separates what's been happening in the West and in the emerging markets. Because in the West, it was the virus that triggered the financial crisis. But in the emerging markets, even though it's a word that doesn't account for tremendous differences within the emerging markets, even South Korea is in the emerging markets, so we're not looking at an homogeneous group of countries. But nevertheless, in many of them, the financial shock preceded the disease. And that means, for example, in South Africa, that before the lockdown was imposed, we've seen capital flight in the country, we've seen unemployment skyrocket in the country, and we've began to see riots against the lockdown because people were being put out of work in a precautionary effort to stop the disease while the disease wasn't there. So we've seen sort of riots against the lockdown and people trying to protect their jobs, formal or informal, that they were. And to some extent, this sort of ambivalence being present also in Michigan. Now in Michigan, that's always had a low rate of unemployment. We're seeing unemployment at 25%, and we've seen the protest last week, and workers politicized obviously to the right, but they were saying what's worth dying for and asking to be put back to work. So to conclude, I've been just trying to sketch out what's been happening in the labor sector, but obviously it's a very, very sort of quick sketch. But I wanted to go back to Silvia Federici in Caliban and the Witch. She spoke about, she recalls the black plague, and she looked at what the black plague sort of implied in terms of struggles. And she said that at the end of the black plague, scarcity of labor, which the epidemic caused, shifted the power relation to the advantage of the lower classes. Obviously, in that case, there had been a demographic collapse, which is not what we see now, because now we're just at the beginning of the pandemic. And so we're seeing that the power relation is really not much in our hands. And I guess the main trends that to me are worth sort of emphasizing is the incredible amount of insecurity that is increasing by the day in the real economy, in the financial economy, in the health sector per se. So we're looking at three crises, and I think on some level that the notion of care and social responsibility that's been imposed by the state should become like a social responsibility, like a collective responsibility to take care of the health of society, but also to sort of make sure that labor protection and health security is guaranteed in the labor sector as much as possible, with no distinction between who's deserving or undeserving of care and protection. I would stop here for the time being.
Shall I just continue right away?
Yeah, please go on. We can collect questions after your talk.
All right. Well, first I want to thank Francesca. This is really a great talk. A lot of what you said really resonated with my own research, and you gave me a lot to think about also afterwards, especially with respect to the logic of sacrifice that you were discussing and hierarchies of sacrifice. I think there's a lot of the same logic going on in the platform economy with respect to platform labor, which I'll be discussing in a moment. So thank you for that. And especially your words, your talk also made me want to now return to Elizabeth Povinelli's work, especially Economies of Abandonment, because that's where she really talks about this logic of sacrifice and the language and discourses of love coming together. And I think there's a lot more to say here. So this is really, really, really great already. And it also sets up nicely, I think, as a kind of a broader overview of context, what I'm going to be talking about now, which is based on my own ongoing research, platform labor. And I want to start the talk with a brief 30-second clip that was shared by Antonio Casilli on Twitter. Let's see if this works properly. I've never shared a screen using Skype before. Let's see, share screen. Here, look. Yeah. And here, can one of you let me know whether you see what I'm seeing now? Just to be sure.
I think we are seeing the video. Yeah.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, Twitter. Okay, great. So he shared this. And he, as he wrote, this is Milan, the epicenter of the COVID-19 epidemic. He wrote this, by the way, when was this? He posted this on April 14th. And midnight is the time when the invisible become visible. The deserted metro, apart from a few dozen young and less young delivery men who return home. That's what it was translated as two-speed containment, but I think the containment at two speeds or two velocities is a better translation because it comes from French. It says here, confinement à deux vitesses. And I just want you to have a look at this, and then that forms the starting points, say, of my talk here. I'll just make it big. So what you see here are a lot of mostly migrant delivery workers waiting to get, well, what is probably one of the last metros out of the city, or at least out of the center city, back to their own homes. And you just see the whole rows and rows of, there's basically nobody else except these delivery guys. And I found that, oh wait, it starts over again. So I'll quit here. And then I'll, well, I can leave it here, or I can stop sharing the screen. Let's see. Screen sharing off, I think. Do you see me now? Hello?
No.
Oh, let's see. I should stop sharing. Stop sharing. All right, there. I think now you should be able to see me again, right?
Yes, yes. Now we see you perfect.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Maybe I shouldn't have started with the video, but I found it a very evocative video, and it gave me kind of an opportunity or an angle into the talk that I have prepared. It's structured around 4 points. And the first point, these points are more like claims or statements. The first statement is platform labor is migrant and minority labor. And although this might seem obvious to some of us, I really don't think that this is sufficiently addressed, especially in the literature and the research on the gig economy and on the platform-mediated labor. So I think that this is something that needs to be addressed much more for us to be able to make sense of how the gig economy functions, and what are and its unequal distribution of opportunities and challenges. Because if just based again on what we just saw in that brief video. So after their long shift as so-called essential workers, servicing urban households and ensuring their social reproduction, they return to their own homes, usually outside the city center, where their own social reproductive needs have been structurally disregarded, and of course also of their families. And whereas social distancing is not possible during their own work, and I'm sure you've read and seen some examples of this, where they have to really struggle to find useful protective gear. Uber and Deliveroo or Glovo are hardly protecting them or providing them with any personal protective equipment. So they have to kind of improvise, and you see them with improvised masks, at least here in Amsterdam as well. So they protect themselves as much as they can, because social distancing during the work is not a possibility. But it has, at the same time, it's important for us to recognize that it has long been accomplished in the realm of social reproduction, especially in terms of housing, namely by segregation. Right? So these communities have long been socially distanced in that respect through, well, in the United States, redlining and everywhere else, gentrification and effective segregation. The thing is, even though we know how poor the working conditions are and poor the pay is, we see them making this trip and coming to work into the city every day again and again. And the question is why, right? And I think the simple answer to this is that they simply have few better options, and that is a hard reality that we have to engage with as well. And I think that is also something that my work is trying to get at. What opportunities and real alternatives do they have? And in my interviews so far, and my work is my field work was in New York City, in Berlin, and in Amsterdam. Constantly hear, well, it's basically the best option for me at this moment, or in general, because other alternatives on low-wage labor markets and oftentimes informal labor markets are even worse. So this is something that should give us pause and should have us think. And this is also something I want to further address in this brief talk. First, then, my second point, the second claim: platform labor is a site of ambiguity and ambivalence. Because on the one hand, it gives migrant workers quick access to income. It has very low entry barriers. You can sign up quite quickly. You can even get a referral bonus if you're lucky, if somebody else signs you up and you complete the first 30 trips. And it also gives them relatively, at least, more autonomy than some of the other options available to them in terms of scheduling their shifts, or when to work and when not to work. But also in terms of at least having the feeling that there's no boss breathing down their neck. That in my interviews came up again and again, that, you know, sure, it's not completely free and I have to work, but there's not a boss who constantly is rushing me, who's pushing me, pushing my buttons. So for them, those things are very much upsides to gig work, and they are some of the reasons why they quote unquote choose gig work. But of course, as many of us have discussed, there's also the income volatility, there's the constant risk of deactivation or deprioritization, so that you suddenly don't get the orders or the rights that you first were getting, and something, you know, changed in the algorithm and you have no idea why you got deprioritized. But also, of course, physical hazards, and in this case, of course, the risk of infection, and not having any proper insurances for this. Of course, there's some platforms have offered some minor forms of hazard pay or insurance, but it's really window dressing, and it's laughable and it's shocking. So while it works as a stopgap and a stepping stone, this kind of work, it often ends up becoming a dead end. And this also is a thing that came up again and again in many interviews. And my point vis-a-vis the pandemic, vis-a-vis the corona pandemic that we're experiencing now, is that this pandemic exacerbates this situation, because as we see that more and more people are losing their jobs, either permanently or temporarily, I already see here now in Amsterdam that more and more people are, again, just like back in 2010, in the aftermath of the crisis that birthed these platforms, these gig economy platforms, now again, a lot of people out of work are also joining these platforms. Again, using it as a stopgap opportunity, but they also might as well might in the future get stuck. So there's rising unemployment, which means that there's more competition on these platforms, which increases these same logics of income volatility and the risk of deactivation. So this also brings me to the third claim, namely that labor platforms are low-wage and low-road, so-called low-road employers or labor market intermediaries, yet they are still not recognized as such. And this is of course the case because they are, well, in courts they're constantly appealing or settling out of court, and there's this ongoing regulatory arbitrage, especially in the beginning. And what we see over time, the last couple of years, is there's also an increase in regulatory entrepreneurship. So instead of avoiding laws and legislation, actively in policy circles and regulatory circles on different levels of government, both the local, the national, and the supranational level, actively pushing to and lobbying to either change things in their advantage or to keep things as they are as much as possible. Now, as you probably know, but before I go there, one more thing, and another reason why they are not recognized as such as low-wage, low-road employers is because there's this still, despite a lot of protests, a lot of questioning, there's still this dominant paradigm of platform exceptionalism, which has in many ways secured for these platforms a sense of immunity, which I would call platform immunity. It has made them immune from a number of other regulations that pertain to are pertinent for other employers. Now, then, of course, a lot of labor lawyers have said that we need reclassification, and of course, reclassification and making these workers employers is one option, but it's only a partial solution, because what we can, of course, learn from literature on migrant labor, especially low-wage sectors, is that regulatory evasion and avoidance by low-wage employers is rampant, right? So, and furthermore, and more fundamentally, employment as such, as an institution, has been always the problem for immigrants and not the solution, because it's for immigrants, employment, the standard employment relationship especially, has been a site of exclusion and of struggle, because employment is for citizens mostly and not for immigrants. And of course, there's a very there's a hierarchization there as well. So in other words, the problem is not only enforcement, but the law itself is the problem here as well. Right? So to counter the social domination at the heart of platform labor and of platform capitalism, we need a more radical policy and regulatory overhaul at the intersection of employment, immigration, and welfare legislation. And now, especially, this is the time in this pandemic when, you know, it becomes even more of a pressure cooker. This is now really the time to make such changes, because you know, we see what is happening otherwise. And yet this is still not all. And this brings me to my fourth and final claim or point. Platform labor is also data labor. So platforms are not just more of the same, but they also change the rules of the game, right? There's a lot of I've had a lot of debates with people that say, these platforms are you know, they're just, you know, they're just low-wage employers and there's nothing else. And although I've partly argued that in my previous point, I'm also kind of allergic to these kinds of claims, because platforms are definitely not just like any type of low-wage employer. And one of the main things that makes them different is their power that they gain through datafication. And this is something that I've been writing about with a colleague of mine, Adam Badger, and this will come out in an article in Antipode later this year, what we call dual value production. So the monetary value of the service provided is augmented by the use and the speculative value of the data that is produced before, during, and after the service provision. Right? So by use value, I mean the value of the data, the practical use value of the data to be used for optimizing operations, right? Data-driven, to optimize their analytics engines and their operations. operations, but also the speculative value of how much that data is worth as an asset, right? Because the latter, the data asset, is ultimately expropriated from the gig workers. It is not remunerated, and it is also frequently used against them, right? If this data is used to optimize cost efficiencies, for instance, this usually goes at the expense of gig workers. So this data expropriation at the heart of is at the heart of dual value production. That's the real side of alienation and unfreedom, which is at the heart of the so-called free gig economy. So it is these data assets, meanwhile, that keep attracting finance capital as well. So that's a connection to the speculative value. And why do investment firms keep investing in these companies if they're so, if they're hemorrhaging money and having so many losses? Because they believe in the potential to leverage this data to create competitive advantages and synergies across industries, across sectors, and also across spheres of social reproduction. And I think that this is also what we're seeing now during this corona pandemic, and even seeing this in an intensified and accelerated form. And I think one of the most recent examples is that now in the UK, the Competition and Markets authorities have just okayed Amazon's huge, I think, $500 million investment in Deliveroo. First, they were very skeptical, but because Deliveroo was apparently also at risk because of the COVID epidemic, and they're supposedly providing all these essential services, that has kind of swayed the discourse, and now the CMA has approved this investment in order so that Deliveroo can further scale and expand its services and become increasingly infrastructural. So this is what I've then tried to show and discuss in a recent blog post, Disrupting Business as Usual. I believe that was also one of the reasons why I was invited to say something here. Because what we see is that platform companies are leveraging this pandemic to become increasingly infrastructural by offering so-called data-driven solutions. And they're doing this in kind of two ways. First, by focusing all their capital and their efforts on delivery and logistical services, right? Whereas home cleaning and ride sharing has diminished incredibly. We now see Uber, refocusing its attention much more on Uber Eats, but also offering other kinds of low-wage labor markets, Uber Works, for instance, and very much targeted on delivery and logistical services in this so-called quarantine society, which again is very segmented based on race, class, and gender, as Francesca also has addressed. Because it's a big difference between those who work from home and who work either on the streets or in people's homes, right? And the second thing is that they are constantly across the board, and I offer a number of examples in the blog post, offering this so-called helping hand to local governments and to nonprofit organizations, and engage increasingly in public-private partnerships where they claim to, through their logistical services and taking care of the last mile problem, helping and supporting vulnerable populations, at the same time ignoring the social reproductive needs of their own workforce, right? So all in all, this then will need or requires a broader response beyond this intersectional approach to policy and regulatory reform. I think we also need to think about audits, right? Algorithm auditing and software auditing. We need to think of new forms of data rights that go beyond the insufficient GDPR regulations, and we need to think about what can be done at the intersection of competition law and labor law, for instance. But this is a thing that I'm still thinking about, and so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot to both Francesca and Niels for these quite expanded overviews about the current situation and for the insights they gave us to somehow reframe the current conditions we are living in. So now, for if everyone has some questions or comments for our speakers, please do it now, so we can collect some questions or comments, and then we will give back to our speaker for answers, and then we can close. So if anyone has some questions, please, this is the moment for doing that.
If nobody has something, I can start with some remarks, some comments. Maybe you hear me?
Yes, go on, please.
Okay, just thanks to Francesca and Niels. I want only to make some brief remarks inspired by their speeches. First, regarding the lockdown and this politics of the lockdown, because it's quite clear that it has been adopted by a large number of countries, but not all the countries had the same possibility to manage this lockdown in the same way. It's quite clear that European Union, United States, China, they can face this lockdown through an enlargement of the debt to the central banks. While, for example, in other countries, like, for example, from Latin America to Africa, they cannot use the debt as a tool to manage this lockdown. So this will create, I think, this will enlarge the gap between the South and the North, also in the a global perspective. So for this first point, so nobody's leaving the lockdown in the same way. Second point is about the so-called smart working. So this division, this technical division between the work at home and the work at place. I think that that there is the risk to idealize also the smart working. I think that also this other kind of organization of labor could bring some problems in terms of psychological problems, overworking. It depends also on the living conditions that personally you have. So it's bringing the social reproduction dimension directly inside also the working dimension. And finally, Francesca was remembering about the plug and the potentialities for workers to bargain better conditions because of some other conditions, but to bargain some better working conditions. And it's clear that it's not exactly the same now, but I think that, for example, platform workers in some cases could be in a similar condition. It's clear that this crisis is also accelerating some transformations, some technological transformations, some productive transformations, and platforms could be one of the winners in the market concurrency. So maybe the point is that they have to bargain a better working condition, as they also are recognized as essential workers. The point is how, because it's clear that in this moment it's not easy, because you cannot live in you cannot act in the public space as in so-called normal conditions. So we will see what will happen.
I just want to say those are great. Those are good points, and I don't necessarily have something to contribute or to add to that at the moment.
Yeah, I also agree with what Maurizio was saying. I think I do have two things that I'd like to that his points make me think of, and one is that I think the IMF has received 100 requests for financial loans over the past maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So I do think we are looking at a debt crisis. I don't think Europe's better off, Southern Europe's better off than some emergent markets or countries at the south, so to speak, in terms of looming sovereign debt crisis. I hope I'm wrong, but and the second thing is, well, no second thing. That was a point. So yeah, that was it for now.
So, if I can jump in, I would have a question for Niels, but inspired by Francesca, actually, because Francesca was quoting the article of Financial Times, I guess Financial Times or Guardian, I don't remember, was saying that we are passing from adjusting time to adjusting case economy, or if of that there is this, that would be this tendency. And my question was about was for Niels about how do you see the post lockdown economy, let's say, in term of platforms. So for example, quoting what Maurilio was just saying, platform seems to be the very winner, like of the next market economy. And so my question was how you see in the future, let's say, the role of platforms, and how they will change maybe in some direction. And if you see some, let's say, changement occurring, for example, in the direction of platform cooperativism or that kind of organizations.
Thank you for your question. Well, first of all, I don't think, just to be sure, platforms, all these platform companies are not all going to be winners, of course. There's a very significant winner-take-all logic within them, in their intercompetition, their intercompetitive dynamics. And I think a lot of them will probably lose and have to fold or merge with others. I think such a consolidation has already been happening over the last 1 or 2 years. But there's definitely some companies, especially I think Amazon, and then now Amazon funded Deliveroo and perhaps Uber, will rise to this occasion and come out as quote unquote winners, to the extent that the dependencies and their infrastructural role, as in terms of creating particular dependencies and new partnerships, they will, if they play their cards right, become sustainable and or sustained also after this the lockdown ends. So what you call the post-lockdown economy. And if they solidify their position during the lockdown, they can try to thrive and to leverage that increased power also in the post-lockdown, and by finally starting to, for instance, raise commissions, right, and raise prices. And actually, this commission raising has already started during the pandemic. Some platforms, actually quite a lot of platforms, have been also criticized because apparently they raise their commission, the cut that they take from each order. And restaurants have been really struggling already, and they claim to be helping restaurants, but at the same time they're already using their increased power to actually increase their profitability, quote unquote, but at least their revenue, I should say. And again, I think this allows them to, if they do this well, to build on the increased power and the increased network that they're building up, and leverage these dependencies also afterwards. Therefore, if that's the case, which I believe is the case, but we can argue about that, I also think that platform co-ops they already had. I mean, I'm already quite skeptical about the extent to which they can really form an alternative, at least at scale. And I think that the same dynamic will actually be exacerbated also in the post-lockdown. I mean, there's definitely also, especially now in Berlin, that I know of, new initiatives bubbling up and taking shape, but they are struggling with the basics. A lot of it is financial, to really get this going. And I think that unless governments, local governments or national governments, actively step in and support it, subsidize it, or in other ways support it, I think platform co-ops will actually increasingly struggle rather than struggle less in this post-lockdown economy. Yeah, those are my first thoughts after hearing your questions.
Okay, I don't know if there are other questions. We were supposed to do a sort of a 1 hour seminar, so I think that if there are no other interventions, we can close here. The video of the webinar will be posted on our blog and our Facebook in the next days. So really thanks a lot for these quite intriguing perspectives that Francesca and Niels gave us today. The next appointment of this cycle of webinars is next Tuesday at 5 p.m. We will discuss about the politics of pandemics, or the politics within a pandemic, with Tanya Rispoli, who is going to give us a perspective from the US, and we will have a second intervention that will be more centered on what's going on in the Chinese context with Simone Pieranni. So thanks a lot to everyone, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Francesca, for a really great talk. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Niels, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
A lot.